try, and I'm going to just kill my camera because I don't need to be in everybody's face. But I'm going to spend this session, which is hopefully my last full session, before I can hand it over to these other guys. I want to go through the data-centric database and do a review of the JSON driver code. I want to pull all of the stuff that we've been throwing around for months now. Heavy lifting of the database, data centricity, etc., etc. I want to try and pull all of that together and actually show you working code so that it might help you understand and get a good idea of what it's all about. So also, I've spared you in the past from a lot of my little quotes that I've collected over the years, and I'm going to unload them all on you. This is Alvin Toffler. He's one of the people I enjoy most, and he's got a good point here. You've actually got to bear in mind the big things, the whole big picture, while you are doing all these little things we've been talking about, because that must be only doing that are you sure that they will all go in the right direction. So that's a quote I like a lot, and I want to start by trying to define in more concrete form what is meant by data centricity and as a concept, because we've been using that word ever since we started talking to you guys. And we want now to try and just put some meat on those bones so that you understand exactly what data centricity is. And because we asked you last session, do you want to adopt data centricity as a policy, as a philosophy? So I thought we'll start this session today just by putting some definitions down as to what exactly data centricity is. So it's an approach to designing systems, applications, and business processes where data is the primary and most valuable asset within an organization. And this, I don't believe anybody can argue with, that the data that you have in your database is the most valuable thing that your business, your organization has. Without it, you might as well close the doors. In a data-centric model, data is independent of applications and is managed as a shared authoritative resource across the whole organization. And the third point of this is this contrasts with the traditional application-centric models, where data is often siloed within individual applications. So that is a definition of data centricity. Now, I only found this out yesterday, but there is a data-centric manifesto, which you can make a note of this or you can look it up, but it actually lays out a manifesto about data centricity. I'll wait for it here. The principles of data centricity, a description, a more complete set of principles, and how we feel about it. It's very simple, but actually quite an important thing. And interestingly enough, it compares the application-centric to the future data-centric, and you can see where and how it compares. You can look at this in your own time. But I just thought I would mention it. So it's something you can look at to help you make the decision about how seriously you're going to approach data centricity. Okay, we're going to look at some key principles of data centricity. Data as the source of truth. Data is stored in a central, well-governed repository, and applications interact with it rather than owning it. So data is an entity in its own right. No application owns it. That is key principle number one. Number two, separation of data and applications. Data is managed independently of specific applications, ensuring longevity and interoperability. Now, our philosophy, Tembo's philosophy and AO's philosophy, applies this separation of data and applications by the use of IO servers. We separate applications from data by creating IO servers as the border control between applications and the data in the database. 3, governance and security. Strong governance policies define data ownership, access controls, and integrity, particularly on the IBM I. The security on the IBM I is superb. And using IO servers, adopting owner authority, and having ownership of the database vested in a specific user profile can secure your data very tightly against anybody using it or stealing it or viewing it. So that if it's a separate entity wrapped up in its own security, you can control it better. Interoperability. Standardized data models enable seamless integration across different systems and applications. So you build your data models with a focus on the data and the integrity of that data, and the applications can then access it as and when they would like to. Lifecycle management. Data is treated as an enduring asset and managed with proper versioning, archival, and compliance policies. Again, independent of an application. Now, an enduring asset, it lasts for a significant period of time. Data is valid for a significant period of time. It's not forever, because data does expire. But that all depends on the company and their policies in terms of how much data they want to keep. But it is a long-term asset and must be treated as such because it's valuable. And then the meta-driven architecture, data definitions, schemas, and relationships are explicitly defined to enhance automation and reusability. That is exactly what AO does for a database. It maintains the data definitions, relationships, etc., etc. So those are the 6 key principles of data centricity. Okay, we don't do anything without a reason. And what are the benefits of the data centricity? Improved data quality and consistency. That is the number one. It reduces redundancy and ensures a single source of truth, i.e., the data can be relied upon to be accurate 100% and exists as one truth. The second benefit is your enhanced security and compliance. It's much easier to enforce access controls and meet regulatory standards and requirements. The third one is greater flexibility and agility. Because your applications evolve independently of the database, you can be much more flexible and much more agile than if you have applications that silo particular data, and it makes it unavailable to other applications. And then the fourth benefit is better decision making, enables advanced analytics and AI-driven insights. That I put in there because everybody likes to see the letters AI. Enables advanced analytics. If you have a well managed, accurate, truthful database, your analytics are based on something that is valid and useful. The AI-driven insights, I don't even know what AI stands for. So I'm not going to make an opinion there, but definitely the analytics, the ability to extract data and create meaningful decisions based on that data is vitally important. Okay, so that is data centricity. And I like this particular slide because it's true. You do need, again, it ties in with the earlier quote. You need to actually see the big picture before you actually start doing anything, because if you don't, you're going to paint yourself into a corner. So that's what this is all about. Now, what is the IBMI? The IBMI is a referential database, i.e., you build the first layer of the database using referential integrity or referential constraints. And this is the command that is used to add referential constraints to the database. Now, I'm not going to worry too much about this. This is the foreign key file. This is the parent file. But what I'm most concerned about is this thing called the delete rule. And I'm bringing this here into focus because this is something that is very important to understand clearly what it does when you begin to start connecting your database together. Now, with the mini database, which I'm coming to, I have tried to put connections together. They're simple, they're small, they're uncomplicated, but they're realistic. So the delete rule I need to look at very carefully with you guys. So please, I hope you've got coffee. Drink some more just to chirp yourself up, because you must pay attention now. This is IBM's definition of what the delete rule in a relationship is all about. It specifies the delete rule for a referential constraint between a parent file and a dependent file. The delete rule restricts or defines the effect of deleting a record in both the parent file and the dependent file. Now, one of the biggest problems with databases is orphan records. Records that are floating around in the database that don't have a parent. And I am sure that that probably is a case in the majority of databases out there in the world today. There are orphans floating around, and that makes a problem sometimes. So the delete rule has been put in place to manage the action of the delete of a record in one of the two. Now, the delete rule has 5 possible values. And why I'm going through this very carefully, because we're talking about data-centric, data-centricity, and the first thing about data-centricity is to get your relationships right and define the relationships between data files. And part of that relationship is what happens if one of those records is going to be deleted. So let's have a look at the 5 different possible values, because this is going to bring into focus another issue that you've got to be aware of. If the value is no action, which by the way is the default, the no action delete rule is used. The delete rule is enforced, and notice this, at the end of the delete request. Now, the end of a delete request is when all before triggers are complete when the record has been marked for deletion and when all the after delete triggers have been fired. Only then is that the end of the delete request, and then the relationship is enforced. So you can change the relationship by what you do in the before and after triggers if you use a no action. The following are attributes of the no action delete rule. Deleting a record in the parent file is permitted if data, and here it's an important statement, for a non-null parent key does not match data for a foreign key, i.e., it will allow you to delete a record in the parent if there's nothing in the dependent file. But what is very important here is for a non-null parent key. And this comes back to something I said some time ago. In fact, when we were discussing the rules of Codd's rules of the database, he said you've got to make a decision about null values because it's got to be consistent throughout the database. But this is a hidden thing I battled with to find anything in the manuals about this. If you define a key in a file as a null capable field, and that field contains a null, all relationships that contain that key are ignored. i.e., if you have a relationship, but it's got a null key value, the relationship is completely ignored. It's bypassed by the system. It's not applied. So be very careful about using null keys, because that can cause incredible problems because your referential constraints are not applied by the system. So you can delete it if it does not match the data for a foreign key. It is restricted if data for a non-null parent key matches data for a foreign key. So that's the no action rule. It says you can only delete a parent if it has no dependent records and it is applied after the delete request is completed. Okay. The second value is the restrict rule. The restrict delete rule is used. The delete rule is enforced at the beginning of the delete request. It's a subtle difference. This relationship is looked at first before any before triggers, before any after triggers. So it's enforced at the beginning of the relationship, beginning of the delete. And these two are exactly the same. The only difference between no action and restrict is that one is enforced at the end and one is enforced at the beginning. And I will show you an example of the differences. Then you get this rule that says cascade. Now, I have used the cascade delete rule a lot in the AO database because it's easy and because I had no reason not to. But when I was investigating other techniques, I found there was a problem with the cascade delete. The cascade delete rule, deleting a record in a parent file causes matching records in the dependent files to be deleted when data for a non-null parent key, there it is again, matches data for a foreign key, i.e. a cascade delete action says if I delete a parent record, it deletes all the dependent records. Now, I know what you're all thinking, or most of you are thinking, hey, that's a great one because then I don't have to worry about orphans. Francis is nodding his head. I can see that even on your avatar. Because then if I delete a parent record, all its dependencies are removed. And as a result, I don't have to worry about orphans. This is absolutely true. Except there's a small problem. If you use the cascade delete, you are creating a situation where the deletions are taken care of by the database, and therefore you may not use before or after delete triggers because they clash with the cascade delete functionality in the mechanics of the database management. So it means that if you use a cascade delete, it's very simple, but if you want to use an after delete trigger to update a summary file, and if I'm not mistaken, Bernard, you do that. Am I right? You use after triggers to update summary files.
Yes.
Yeah. And so if you want to delete a record, you want the after trigger to go and adjust the value in a summary file because it's been deleted from the database. That you are not able to do if you're using a cascade delete, because the delete after delete trigger is not available to you. So when I came across this, I thought to myself, it's okay for me because I don't have that need. I was busy trying to develop a particular technique which forced me into looking at this closely. So you've got to think about this very carefully, and I'm going to say now that it's better not to use it. There is another way of getting rid of orphans, and I will show that to you just now. But use it when it's appropriate, realizing that your before and after delete triggers are not available to you. On both files, by the way, not just on the parent and not just on the foreign key, but on both sides of that constraint, your before and after triggers are not available. Before and after delete triggers are not available. Right, and then set null delete rule is used. Deleting a record in a parent file updates matching records in a dependent file. Update, note that, updates matching records in a dependent file. If data for a non-null parent key, there it is again, matches data for a foreign key. If the matching foreign key field is null capable, the value is set to null. If the matching foreign key field is not null capable, the field is not updated. I would stay right away from this one because it has can have unexpected consequences, particularly if you are using nulls. Null is a common thing for SQL. It's not so common in our RLA type databases we use. Note, to use this rule, a minimum of one field in the foreign key access file must be null capable. What it does is it leaves the child record in the file, but it makes its key fields null. It doesn't make sense to me. You're removing the parent and you're leaving the child key in with null fields. I don't see the reason for it. But unfortunately, this word updates here means that this is an update action which taking place by the database. And therefore, you are not able to use the before update or the after update triggers if you use this particular action on the delete rule. So you lose your ability for before update and after update triggers. Same way as with the cascade delete, you lose the ability for the before and after deletes. Here you use the before and after updates. Then there's the last one, which is set default, which is exactly the same as the set null, except it sets the dependent key to the default value, but also has the same effect of restricting use of the before and after update triggers. So I recommend, when you are making decisions on this line, that you use the no action or the restrict, depending on whether you want this to be applied before the triggers or after the triggers. The other ones must be used with caution. And if you are using after triggers, after delete or after update triggers for any purpose whatsoever, you can't use this. And don't be tempted to say, oh, yes, well, then I will just leave the constraint off. Because that's not clever either, because you're building a relational database and the relationships are the key to the primary structure of your database. Right. Now we get to my fun and games. This is my little mini database, mini data-centric database. And I've created, oops, I think I've left some. Anyway, I've created a bunch of files, a small bunch of simple files. I've created a customer master file. And excuse me for 1 second, but I think I'm going to have to, what have I done with it? Yeah. I'm going to just have to see whether I've got to put in, give me a second. I haven't got stuff code up that I wanted to have up. Right. Just so that we can, this is the customer master file. I've kept it as simple as I possibly can. It's got a customer number, which is a numeric. It's got a record status, customer name, 3 lines of address, a postcode, a starting date, a discount percentage, and a sales rep code. So all is there. It's quite simple, no complications. I created a customer balances file because the balances on the customer are more dynamic than the details of the customer master file itself. And one of the normalization principles is that you separate the more dynamic components from the more static components of a particular file. So the balances file is there. It has the customer number, obviously. It has a record status. It has current due, current 30 days, customer total outstanding, and that's all. Very simple. Just an excuse to have a different file more than anything else. Then I created a rep master file because obviously I need to be sure that the customer master file contains a valid rep number. And the rep master file is, where is it? I've got so many of these things that you're going to have to forgive me. The rep master file, again, is very simple. It has a numeric rep code. It has a record status, a rep name, a cell number, and a commission percentage. That's it. I've kept them simple and small records so that we can relate and we can understand how they relate together. Then I created an invoice header file because obviously customers are going to have invoices, and we're going to have an invoice header file. We're going to have a look at that. There it is. It has the customer number, obviously. It has an invoice number, a record status, an invoice date, invoice total, rep code, and user ID. The user ID there is to indicate which user was the last user to touch this record. Oh, sorry, there's a bill to customer number there as well. That was put in deliberately for something that I want to show two relationships between two files. So that's the head. And then we had an invoice detail file, obviously, which would be This one, invoice detail file, customer number, invoice number, line number, which is numeric, record status, product code, product quantity, product unit of measure, product price, gross, discount amount, tax amount, net amount. It's an invoice line, pretty much straightforward. The invoice header has an invoice total, which is where the total for the invoice is kept. So I will show you how that works as well. And then, of course, I had a product master file to go along with all of this, because the product master file has the product code, product description. It carries the product unit of measure, the product price. Those two it carries, obviously, because that's where you would define it on a product. So those are the 6 files that I've created in this mini data-centric database. Now, how do we start making this data-centric? The first thing I do is I create an I/O server for all of them, because there is my separation between database and application. So all of them get an I/O server. And no access is then available on any of these files other than via the I/O server. Now remember, this is an ideal situation. You are not going to do this in one go. You're not going to change your entire database into this in one step. But this is the end result that you would be looking for in the long term. Then what's the next step? The next step is to create a relationship between the customer master file and the rep master file. That's a one-to-many relationship, because there are many customer master file records and there are many rep master files records. So you relate the rep code on the customer master to the rep master file. That makes sure that you can never put an incorrect rep code against the customer master in a customer master. And now I've got to find something else here. These are the relationships. This is AO, and these are the relationships that are defined within this little database that I have here. And there is the relationship that defines the rep code. Rep code, the parent is the rep master file, the parent key is rep code, the foreign key is rep code. And the delete rule, which is the important thing I want you to see, is no action, which means the delete rule is applied after any triggers are applied. So that is that relationship there. The next relationship is a relationship between the customer master file and the balance master file. And in this case, it's a 1-for-1 relationship. Here is your customer balances file. The parent is the master. Cusno is exactly the same. Therefore, this is also a delete rule, no action is a 1-to-1 relationship. There's one balance record for every customer record. We also put in a relationship between the header and the customer. And again, there are 2 of them, in fact. This one is R1. It's the bill to on the header, on the invoice header, is linked to the customer number on the customer master file. This one here is the customer number linked to the customer number on the customer master file. So we have two relationships here between the same two files, but with two different relationship keys. So that's another example of a dual relationship where your foreign key is two different fields pointing at the same parent. Then we have another one-to-many relationship between the detail file and the header file. That is this one here. Notice the key customer number and invoice number is now where it's batching up. So the detail record must match customer and invoice number. But the detail record has one more key in its primary key, which makes it a one-to-many relationship. The key of the detail record is customer number, invoice number, and line number. So there are multiple records for one customer invoice number. So that's a one-to-many relationship there. And then, of course, we have this relationship to the product master file, which is quite simply the product code. I'm not even going to show you that one because that one is obvious. There's a product code on the detail line file, and it must match a valid product master on the master file. Now, what do we do next to make this? This is the first layer of heavy lifting for the database. The second layer is a before trigger for every single record in the database, because every single record in the database must have a before trigger for one or more reasons. And I want to go through the code now of each of these before triggers, because this is where the data centricity begins to kick in, where the trigger programs are starting to do a hang of a lot of work for the database. So let's look at them one at a time. We will look at the rep master first, because the rep master, sorry,
First one.
Is it? Did I put it up front? You did too. Thank you. I've got so much up here. It's unbelievable. All right. The rep master. These triggers were all generated from the template generator. So they all look exactly the same. The prototypes are fairly straightforward. There's a call here. There's a prototype here for a valid call, and I'll talk about that when we get into the code. And there's a create user space function, which is also available, and that will be used. The data definition is pretty much standard. There's the trigger parameter list, which is consistent for every trigger program. That is why I've put it in a copybook. It's exactly the same for every trigger program. There's the trigger name, there's the new record details, the old record details, the user space pointer, and a couple of incidentals, including the user ID is there. Right, so those are the top. Now, the main line is exactly the same for all of these triggers. This one is actually putting the record. It's a before trigger. Once the record has been completed, it's putting it into a user space where it can be picked up by the IO server. There's a reason for that. I'll show you. But you can see there it is. Do the insert, move the new record into the user space, do a delete, move the old record into the user space, and in an update, move the new record into the user space. So the user space at the end of this call will contain the record as it was when the trigger had finished with it. If you look here, I have commented out the call to valid call. What this does, and you've got this routine, I've updated a whole lot of source, which I will show you sometime or send you an email about. It's in your ERR error handlers, which I've updated. It checks the call stack and looks to see whether the originator of this call to this trigger was that program. I.e., if this was uncommented, only the IO server would be allowed to access this file. And that is a protection in line with the data centricity that only IO servers can access the file, which means you're locking out all the millions of SQL clients that may or may not want to get at this file. I've commented them out because I was using DFU to experiment with this thing. And of course, DFU is not an IO server. Other than that, this main line looks identical in every single one of these trigger programs. Now, let's see, what do we do before insert? This is a rep master file. It has a numeric rep code, and I want to give it the next number for every inserted new rep. So I use this technique using a SQL statement to select the maximum rep code from the rep master file, put it into the work string, add 1, and put it in as the new rep code. So I generate, in the trigger program, I generate the new rep code number, which is the next highest number from the highest one on file. I find this way is best because it means that you don't have blanks. If you use a data structure, data area or file or any of those sort of things, you can give yourself with missing numbers. This way you cannot, because this record remains locked until the update is completed. The record status in the insert are set to blank because this file does not use the record status. It's an empty field. And then, of course, we do the validation. So that is what happens on an insert. On an update, we make sure the rep code remains exactly the same. So even if somebody tries to change the rep code on an update, it will not be allowed. This rep code is replaced. The new rep code, whatever it might be, is replaced by the old rep code. And that, by the way, is why where am I? No. Rep code, customer master rep code, no action. No, it doesn't apply to that at all. Sorry, I went off track there. So that is the update process. There's nothing else you need to do before the update other than the validation. Validation is always done both for insert and update. There's a delete action. In this particular case, nothing required in the delete action for a rep. But it doesn't have a cascade delete. It has a no action. So if we're, no, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Here, this one here. It has a no action delete rule. So if you attempt to delete a rep master record and there is a customer record with that rep on it, it will not be allowed. You will not be able to do so. So that could be a restrict. It should be applied up front, but it doesn't really matter because there's no delete action anyway. I want you, if there are any questions, I want you to interrupt me, please. but you're going to have to, I can't see the hand, so you're going to have to shout.
Okay.
All right. Please stop me if I lose you, because if I've lost you once, you're never going to catch up. The validation rules. This is what is set up by the trigger. Each field is given a procedure call. We want only to validate the rep name, the cell number, and the commission percentage. We don't need record status because it's not used, and the rep code is supplied by this trigger, so we don't need to validate that either. So rep name, we check if it's blank, switch on the error indicator and issue an error message because we don't want a blank rep name. The cell number, the same. We don't want a blank cell number because you can't get hold of the guy. And the commission percentage must, if it's less than or equal to 0, it's also an error. Now, please understand something about this. I know users, and I've had users pull this stunt on me before. I test for rep name equals blank. And then they think they're smart, and they'll come back and put the rep's name in later on. So do you know what they do?
Put a space.
They actually, the more commonly, they put a full stop. So that's what I do. And it irritates users who try that every time. But then they get smart and they put a comma, and you can't carry on doing it forever. So you could test for the length and see that it is longer than 1 or 2 characters, etc. There are many ways you can test if your users start to yank your chain. But what can you do? They will find ways around it, no matter what you do. Space is, you see, a space is a blank, so it's not going to come out that way. Right. So those are the validations that have done for this, and they only require a before trigger on the rep master file. Right. Let's have a look at the before trigger on the customer master file. Can you find this one before I can? No, I found it before you. Same main line because it comes from the same template. It's also a user space because the customer number is numeric and I want the system to assign it, so exactly the same code is used there. And in the insert, I get the trigger to put in the start date, regardless of what the client gives me. So the trigger overrides the start date. Then it goes on to the validation. Update forces the customer number to be the same and forces the start date to be the same so that they can't change either of those. But here's, this one does have a before delete function, because what would be the rule for if I want to delete a customer master record? In this particular database, the rule simply says I will allow a deletion of a customer record if there are no outstanding invoices for that customer, and an outstanding invoice would appear in the customer balances file. So the customer balance has to be 0 before I will allow a delete of a customer master. So the balances file has a no action rule, i.e. a delete will be applied at the end of the delete function, at the end of the delete action. So it has to go through the before trigger first. And in the before trigger, I check. I take the customer number, put it into the balances file, customer number. I read the record, and I say, if the customer total outstanding is not 0, throw back an error message and reject the delete. So I can stop the delete with a before delete trigger if there is any balance on that customer. If the customer balance is 0, I'll let it go through. Then, of course, you have your validate, and we have a validation for the record status. This is another way. The record status validation just forces it to 0, to blank rather, because it's not being used. The customer name, again, the same story with a name. You can play games with lengths and all sorts of things. The address line, it has to be at least one address line. So if an address line is blank, it's an error. But address line 2 and address line 3, as you can see, are commented out. My rules don't require them. Your rules may. The postal code, or in your case, the zip code, is required. Otherwise, it's an error. The start date is not validated. The discount percentage is validated, and it's got to be between greater than 0 and less than 30. Or is that the right way around? If it's less than 0 or greater than 30, it's an error. So it's got to be between 0 and 30. So there's a validation for the discount percentage that is maintained in the trigger. And that applies either to the insert or the update, because you'll notice that the validation happens on the insert and on the update, but not on the delete, because I've thrown it out. I'm not worried about it. So that is the before trigger for the customer master file. Now we'll go and have a look at what the before trigger for the customer balances file does. No, got the wrong one. Here it is. It will be exactly the same main line. This time I've left the valid call in. I don't know why I did that. But, oh, I do know why I did this, because Cusbel dollar is the IO server, and it will only allow updates through the IO server. There's a reason I did that. I'm just furiously trying to think of what it is while I'm talking. Right, there's nothing to do with an insert. It does a validation. That's all. It does have it has nothing to do with the update except validate it. And it has no delete actions at all. So we look at the validations. The only thing that is validated is the record status, which is set to a null. So this trigger basically does nothing. And the reason why this trigger does nothing is because this file is never maintained by a client application. It is maintained entirely within this database. And we will talk about that just now. as to how that happens. Let's have a look at the before trigger for the invoice header file. Would you guys like a break?
Oh, that's good.
Okay, we'll keep going. You just yell if you want a break. Invoice header before trigger, this one here. Again, the same main lines, same basic definitions. What before header insert? We put in the invoice date automatically on an insert, so the invoice date is always there. And of course, that means that in an update, we make sure that the invoice date doesn't change. Other than that, we do an ordinary validation. Delete. If the invoice total, this is a before delete. If the invoice total, which is an invoice header record, by the way, you can always see this by doing that. I can't do that unless I'm doing an edit. There we are. Why is this not playing? Oh, well. Oh, I think I know why. Sorry, just give me a moment. I left off a library on my library list. Anyway, the invoice total is on the record, and if it's not 0, I can't allow the delete. So I throw it out as an error. So there you have, again, a before trigger making sure that the delete is valid. The validate only invoice number and record status. Now, the invoice number is a character field, so I can't generate it on insert. It has to be input by the client. But they've got to put in an invoice number, otherwise it's an error. The record status is also forced to blank because it's not used. And the other one is the user ID. I put the user ID in, and this is in the validation routine, which means that the last person that touched this record will be indicated in the user ID. And this is the header record itself. Okay, so that is the before trigger. So you can see, although the number of lines of code for these before triggers is pretty small, they are doing important functions. Obviously, in your files that are a lot bigger and more complicated, there will be more complicated validations and processes. But if you look at what is needed and you build it into the trigger, you can get better and better at it. Now, you can get more and more of this work into the database, which means it's one place, one rule, one truth. And that's the important thing here. Let's look at the detail file before trigger. There it is. Again, same up to the main line, but this main line.
I have a small question, Tony.
Yes, go ahead.
How would you check if the invoice number for the customer already exists or not in the case of you insert a new invoice at the screen, but you enter the same invoice number as twice, would you check in the before trigger or?
Yes. First of all, if you try to enter the same invoice number for the same customer, your constraint would throw it out and say there's a duplicate record, because remember your primary key.
Yeah, okay. But it's done in the before, it's done on where it will be checked.
You don't need to do it, because in the constraint.
Okay.
Let's have a look at the
unique
constraint.
With the, okay, I understand. Okay.
Yeah, so the header is, sorry, the primary key, which I'm not showing here, but the primary key will be customer number and invoice number. If you try and duplicate that, it'll throw it out. You don't even need to validate it. The one thing you may want to do is, if you try and insert an invoice number for a different customer, but the same invoice number already exists. You with me?
Yeah.
Then you're going to have to devise a method of maybe another file containing valid invoice numbers, or you may have a range of invoice numbers for areas of a customer. There are many different ways. Obviously, you want to do some validation somewhere. It'll be in the before trigger, definitely. And you must decide, is this invoice number valid or not?
Okay.
All right. Where were we? The delete, the detail record trigger. There's no mainline events at all there. Because there is a user space, because there's a number, an invoice number, we have actually used the trigger that develops a user space, and the record that the before trigger finishes off with is placed into a user space, which is available to other programs in this activation group. Sorry, I went blank there for a moment. So, but the interesting part about this is in the insert. In the insert, when we insert, I had to change the SQL a little bit, because I want a line number, and I had to insert a where clause where the customer number is equal to the customer number and the invoice number is equal to the invoice number, because I wanted the maximum line number available for this invoice, not the maximum line number available on the file. So we needed to insert the where clause afterwards. I haven't got a template that has this in. And then we find the invoice number in exactly the same, the line number rather, in exactly the same way, but based on customer and invoice number. Now, remember, this is the detail line before trigger. I get the product code and I check the product code. Now, here, this, by the way, is wrong. This should be a restrict. It is a restrict. Why is it showing no action? It is a restrict. That's odd. I've got a bug. Oopsie. It says restrict. Why did I use the restrict option here? And the answer to that is, here, I use the product code and go and get the product record. There it is. There's the read for the product record. Now, If the product code that has been provided is not on the product file, then this is going to fail. So what I do is I use the relationship which says restrict. This relationship is a restrict relationship, which means it's applied before the before trigger is given control. So if the record contains an invalid product code, it won't even get into the before trigger. It will be thrown out by that relationship before the trigger is even entered. So that is the difference between no action and restrict. Some cases you need one, and some cases you need the other. In this particular case, you definitely need a restrict relationship. Otherwise, this whole thing here will fall over. That will fall over. What I do is I read the product record, and using the customer number, I read the customer record. So I've got both the product and the customer record in place. Make the record status blank. Fill in the product unit of measure from the product master file. It doesn't matter what the client has provided. If they've provided anything, if you're doing this on a graphic screen, I would say that the unit of measure is a display-only field. You don't input into it. The product price comes from the product master file. I calculate the gross by multiplying the item quantity by the product price. I calculate the discount amount from the customer's discount percentage divided by 100 times the gross. I calculate the tax amount. Now this, by the way, is South African VAT is 15%. So I've calculated 15%. But you might want, in this particular case, to call another procedure, a sub-procedure out of a service program to calculate tax, because you have, I know, got, well, I'm not sure about Canada, but the US has got federal tax, they got state tax, they got local tax, they got value-added tax, they got all sorts of taxes. So they have a huge tax calculation that must be in a service program somewhere. I don't know how you calculate tax, but I've done a simple little 15% calculation here to calculate the amount of tax. You can see here I've put in a comment which says tax amount is calc tax gross minus discount amount, i.e. the amount on which the tax must be calculated. You might have to add other parameters like region, area, state, I don't know, whatever. Net amount is the gross minus the discount amount minus the tax amount is the net amount. So notice that all of those fields there are calculated in the before trigger, not in the application. Rounding is handled properly in this trigger. You can never have rounding errors because one program is different to another program. It's always identical because that calculation of those fields is picked up from the product and the customer file and is all done in one place, in one trigger program only. So those are all done by the trigger, not by the application code. Right. That's quite a heavy piece of code for insert. Update. I go and fetch the product and the customer number again, because I'm updating an invoice line. There are a number of things that may have changed. The product code may have changed, the item quantity may have changed, or the customer's discount percentage on the customer master file may have changed. So what I do is I make sure the line number remains the same, I make sure the record status is blank, and then I do the same calculations again in the update. as the so you could take these calculations, which actually are identical, and you could put them in a procedure, another procedure in this trigger program to avoid duplicating the lines of code. I would have done that if I'd had the time and if I'd thought about it at the time. So that is the way. But in the delete, you do nothing. If I'm deleting a line out of an invoice, the before trigger does nothing because I can delete a line at any time that I want to. Okay. Validations. Really, I'm only validating the item quantity. Everything below the item quantity is calculated by the trigger. Everything above the item quantity, that product code is a referential constraint. The record status is blank. The line numbers calculated, and those are controlled by a referential constraint. So the only thing I have to validate is the item quantity, and all I have to do is to make sure it's not 0. If it is 0, I kick it out. So I'm sure you're beginning to get the feeling that actually very few lines of code are required in the trigger program to make an immense difference, or actually to do a lot of work with a very few lines of code. Okay, and of course the product, did we look at the product master before trigger? I can't remember whether we did. No, we didn't. I can tell because it's not compressed. Product master code is very simple. Insert, nothing except to validate, update, nothing except to validate, delete, nothing except in the delete. Why? Because the invoice detail record, where is it? Where is it? Header. Invoice detail. Sorry, this is, I get lost in this. That definition is the product code to product code. If I try and delete a product code that is referenced by one single line of an invoice, it will not let me. Notice this is a restrict. Again, I don't know why. I must look into that. Why the actual view? It's restricted. This relationship is restricted, which means this is applied before the before trigger. On either case. So if there's any doubt about it, it throws it out right at the very beginning. So the only validations that are needed are the product code. It's got to be make sure it's not blank, and it can't be a duplicate. The description not blank, the unit of measure not blank. Now, in a system, you'll probably have a units of measure file, which defines valid units of measure for product, in which case this wouldn't be necessary, and you would do it through another referential constraint. And then, of course, the product price. If it's equal to 0 or less than 0, it's an error. So that is all the validations for the before triggers. And as you've seen, the number of things that these before triggers do in terms of checking deletes particularly are quite important, that you can't delete a customer if there's balances, etc., etc. Now, what do you add next? You add after triggers. But here you add after triggers selectively. The next layer of your database is your after triggers, and not all files need after triggers. The first file that needs an after trigger is the customer master file. And what does the after trigger for the customer master file do? Now remember, we've got through the before triggers. You don't get to an after trigger if the before trigger has found anything wrong with anything. So you don't get here if the before trigger has all, but you do get here if you're using a no action constraint and the before trigger didn't find anything wrong, the constraint is not yet checked. So you come to an after trigger before the constraint gets checked. So let's just have a quick look at the prototypes. Now this particular one has got a IO server for the balances file and an IO server for the headers file. And you'll see why just now. The data definitions are pretty much the same as for every trigger. And let's look at the main line. The main line is pretty simple. It's the same. It's got an event, insert, delete, update. That's it. It does also have errors, and it can return errors from an after trigger, but usually an after trigger won't return an error because the update is done into the database by the time the after trigger is called. It can, and if your client or your IO server gets an error from an after trigger, it just needs to issue a rollback. That's all. What does this after insert do? It clears the balances record, puts the customer number into the balances file, and inserts the balance records. So automatically, when a new customer is added to the database, the after trigger inserts a balance record into the balances file, which means this balance file never gets a record inserted anywhere else. So that is clearly what that does. Now, after update doesn't do anything because the balances record is of no interest to it. You update that. These are the static data for the customer, so it doesn't affect the database. In this particular case, it could in your case. And obviously, you would have to be careful and check to see what sort of impact it would have. But after delete, I can take the customer number from the old record, which is the record that's being deleted, put it in the key for the balances file, and delete the balances record. i.e., I'm cleaning up the balances record. How can I do that? Because the before trigger checked to make sure that the balances record was 0, that the balance for the customer was 0. So when I get to the after trigger, which I wouldn't be here if it wasn't 0, I can simply delete the record because I know it was a 0 record because the before trigger told me that. Then I can do an eval corresponding on the invoice header key using the old record. This is the power of using the same data names in different files, i.e. not prefixing your data names, but keeping the same data name in the same file. The eval corresponding will simply load the key with matching field names and matching attributes. And then I simply, invoice header, I delete all invoice headers for that customer based on the customer number. Now, how can I do that? I'm cleaning up the dependent files. I'm deleting the invoice headers. How can I do that? Do I know that the invoices are not valid? Yes, I do. And I'll show you why. I can quite comfortably delete all invoices. Remember, a delete on the invoice header has a corresponding delete on its after trigger, which will delete all the detail lines. So let's move to the after trigger for the invoice header. Very much the same. This is coming from a template as well. The main line is the same, no difference. After insert, nothing, because after the insert of a header record, I don't need to do anything. After the update, I don't need to do anything. After the delete, I have here in the prototypes, I have an IO server for the delete file. So I can delete the detail lines for that invoice. Again, how can I do that when there may be valid invoices there? This is where I wave my magic wand, and we're going to have a look at the after trigger for the detail file, which this is basically where the whole thing pulls together, and you can begin to see how after insert, now data definitions, prototypes. I've got a balances file prototype and I've got an invoice header file prototype. And this is an after delete. After insert, what am I doing here? When I insert a line into an invoice, I look for the balances file key, which is the customer number. I read the balances file for that customer. I add the net amount to the current due, and I add the net amount to the customer total outstanding, and then I update the balances file. So inserting a detail line in an invoice updates the balances file. So if I deleted a customer and that customer deleted its invoices, it would only allow the customer to be deleted if the outstanding value was 0. But if there was an invoice that was currently active, the balance would not be 0. And therefore the delete of the customer and therefore the delete of its invoices and detail lines would not be allowed. Does that make sense?
Yep.
The other thing is here, I also get the header record, read the header record.
Tommy, Lubick has got a question.
Yes, Lubick.
How would you validate for null values?
Null values. The command for null values is simply if on a trigger.
Yes.
Oh, you want to know whether that field carries a null value?
Yes.
Okay. Can I finish this and then I will show you?
Sure.
Okay, no problem. Here I add to the invoice total, that's on the invoice header, and I update the invoice header. So every time I insert a detail line, okay, I'm adding to the balance due and I'm adding to the invoice total. Now, I could have an after trigger here, I add to the invoice total, and an after trigger on the invoice header, I add to the balance. You can do it either way. After update, it's exactly the same, except I'm adding the difference between the old and new values. So I take the old value, I subtract the new value, and I add that plus equal to the current and the current total. And I do exactly the same for the invoice header and the invoice header. Then in the after delete, I subtract the net amount. Do exactly the same thing, but I'm subtracting the net amount. So in the case of the after trigger for the detail, I'm changing the values on the invoice total, on the invoice header record, and on the customer balances record, which is the reason I know that if I have deleted invoices or I have archived them to another file because they are no longer valid, I will know that the balance is 0, which means I can delete these records without a problem. If the balance is not 0, I can't delete them. Okay, does that make sense? I hope it does. Right, Ludwig. How do you test to see whether a record in the template? Now here is the trigger template. Why? This is also. Okay. I'm going to have to hunt down this thing because it won't give it to me. It should give it to me when I hover over it, but it's not playing. I have here a new record pointer. I have a new record. I have a new null byte map and pointer, and I have a new record null byte map indicator. Now, this indicator occurs once for every field in the file. And you can see this array is based on that pointer. So in the main line, I create the new record pointer by taking the parameter pointer and adding the new offset. The null byte map pointer I create by picking up the new null map offset. Now there is an offset in the parameter list. Let me see if I can find that. I'm irritated now. I need to find that. Source copy. I can't find it. You caught me. Anyway, let me not waste too much time on that. There is a pointer to the new null byte map. There's an offset to the new null byte map, the new record null byte map, and there's also offset to an old record null byte map. Now, those null byte maps, this new one and the old one, carry an indicator which is on or off. In the RPG program, there are no nulls. So if you looked at a field on a debug, you would see there was a default value in it. But if this indicator is on, for that field, and there are 12 fields in the file, so you would address this as NNBMI, 6 or whatever the field was. If that indicator was a 1, it would mean that on file, that field is null. If the indicator is 0, it will mean that on file, that field is not null. And that's the way you do it in the trigger. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Have you got a lot of nulls in your system?
Not really.
No, good. Well, I would suggest humbly, because I've been there, done that, try not to. Nulls have a way of turning around and biting you. That's why you need definitely to develop an overall policy for null fields. When you can use them, never use them in a key of any sort or in a relationship field of any sort. And you must decide, if you're going to use a null, what does it mean? Not applicable, 0, don't know. There can be a lot of things about a null. You need to make a policy decision, company-wide policy decision about what you're going to do with your nulls. And I don't use them very much because I don't find them meaningful at all. The only time I ever use them is when I have a numeric value which can be anything, negative and or positive and or 0. i.e., it is a numeric value that can have anything in it. And I need to indicate that it doesn't have anything, i.e., it has not yet been given a value. And that is the only time I use a null. Because the null will then say, I have not got a value in this numeric field yet. And then you might want in your trigger program to check for it and say, oops, nobody's given it a value yet. I must give it a value of 0, or I must give it a value of 25, or give it a default, or whatever it is. So that's pretty much the only time I ever use them. Unfortunately, those people who've been brought up from the SQL side of the world tend to use nulls an awful lot, because the default for SQL fields is null. That means that there are a lot of fields in those null fields in files that SQL people have created. Okay, so that is how this little database looks after itself. And you can see that a lot of work is done in the after triggers and the before triggers to make sure this little database is consistent in itself. Now, obviously, you might want to go through this recording and stop and have a look and all the rest of it. But it has minimized the impact of these, or the need for the client application to do a lot of things over and over again in different clients. And that is pretty important when you come to the next thing that I'm going to talk about. What is the time? Have I got time? Ooh, I don't know whether I have time. All right, I'll start and see whether I can get there. Just another one of my things to say. Again, Alvin Toffler. Man was actually quite bright. He knew what he was talking about. And this is so true of the world we live in today. There's a lot of unlearning and relearning to be done if we want to move forward. It's always frightening, it's always difficult, but it's necessary to be able to do it. Right. Any questions to the end of that? I think I've had them on the way. Is it okay, or have I got you shell shocked? How's that?
Oh, it's it's good. It's good, but it's just separating the mind for the various treatment, and knowing, oh, this is done by the before trigger, oh, this is done by the after trigger, or this is done by the constraint.
Yes.
All of different little tasks are shared between a lot of so you gotta understand the architecture.
Yes. The first thing you've got to do is to take your whole database. Remember, you don't have to do this all at once. I mean, we've talked about having before triggers that don't crash your applications, the legacy code. You remember I talked about that? And I designed a trigger that will collect the errors but not crash anything, so you can begin with that. It's a process of step at a time. Don't try and do this thing all at once, because the more you do it, the easier it becomes, but you've got to start somewhere. And it also is around this data centricity. I think the first hurdle that needs to be overcome by legacy people, and it's not being negative in any way, but having come through the last 30 years and being where you are, the first big step is to actually separate the database from the application mentally. Not physically at this stage, but mentally. You can learn to think of the database and the application as two separate things. Okay. I think I got this all wrong.
Tommy?
Yeah.
Ludwig has got a question.
Yes, Ludwig.
Is there a way to know which program updated a record in the before trigger?
Which program updated a record in the before trigger? Yes, there is. I wish I could find that. Sorry, let me just, I'm just going to look for something, because I'm absolutely convinced. I don't know why I can't find this thing. I'm just going to look for the trigger parameter list. I don't know why it won't allow me to pick it up from here. Ah, there it is. This is the parameter list that comes in with all triggers. Oh, no. You get the file name, the library name, the member name, but you don't get the program on the trigger. You have to use a variation of this this valid call routine. What this valid call routine does, and I've in fact got one which I can let you have. I've just got to find it. It actually picks up the program name from the call stack, because it looks for the trigger, and then it goes back one layer, and it picks up the program name that called the trigger. And that could be an IO server. In fact, it should eventually only be an IO server. But an IO server is a procedure. So it won't pick up the procedure, it will pick up the program that called the IO server. And I have got that code. It's
Tommy, isn't that sorry for the interruption, but isn't that the code that that you've actually uploaded to their machine, which was part of the December stuff?
It might be. I need to check. I know there was some stuff there. I know the valid call routine is there, but I'm not sure. It's just it's a simple procedure, which can be part. It is. I will put it into the error handler for you because it uses the error handler APIs, and it looks at the call stack and just picks up the program name of the program that called the trigger via the file. So the answer to the question is yes, you can get it. It doesn't come in through the parameter list, unfortunately.
Okay, and would that be a way to prevent triggers from calling themselves, like in a loop?
Yes, it would be, because the trigger would say, oops, me called me, so I mustn't do this. So yes, you could. But I don't see how you could actually achieve that.
If I update a record, another record on the file that I'm updating, but through the trigger itself.
Golden rule of triggers. Never move the trigger pointer, the record pointer. When your IO server or your client calls a trigger, say for example, does an update, the first thing it does is it does a chain to that file, and that sets the record pointer to point at the record that it's dealing with. Then it calls the trigger. Well, it does an update, and the update causes the database management system to call the trigger. Now, if you go and read another record off the same file, you have got rather large problems. It's known as the exhaust pipe effect. Okay.
Exhaust piper.
Yeah. You go around so fast that you end up going up your own exhaust pipe.
Okay.
It's not a good thing to do. If you want to do that, and you can do that, if it becomes absolutely necessary to do that, then the second call to that file must be done through a logical file, which means you've got another open data path. Okay. But you've got to be careful because it can get you into some deep trouble. You shouldn't need to. What have you got a thought in mind as to why you would want to do this?
Well, right now I'm working on a master that that gets recalculated depending on the detail files, and each detail files depend on the previous ones. So when I update a detail file, I want to recalculate the master and every other detail files after itself.
So you're using an after trigger.
It's a before trigger.
Yeah,
But maybe I should be using an
problem, Tommy, is that there is relations between the detail file records.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you update, then you have to validate with the previous record, and so sometimes you have to modify the previous record because it's a chain. What we try to do is an itinerary. Okay, So okay, that's the first step in the itinerary, and then the second line is the second step of the itinerary, but it's got a relation with the first record. So it's maybe we start to complicate with triggers, but
this one needs a little bit of thought. It's
Maybe
similar.
maybe we can talk about it offline.
Yes,
in a separate meeting.
I think we can. Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. In some databases, you can have foreign keys that point back to the same table. Is that possible here?
Yes, you can store keys.
That might help. I don't know.
Okay. I'm just, my mind, of course, is racing in circles here.
Ludovic too.
Yeah. Look,
Tommy, my suggestion would be is let's schedule something separate offline.
Yes, I think we should do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we can have a look at the problem in a little bit more detail so that I can actually understand where the problem is coming from. The one thing I do know for a fact in my life is that there's never been a problem you can't solve one way or another. So
yeah,
that's the best way to do it. All right. I haven't got much time left. I don't know why my files got out of order. Okay. Now, based on what we've just talked about, I now want to quickly walk through at least the basics of this JSON driver and support code. Which we talked about earlier as being the JSON driver program and the authorization services and the parsing services. These were the things that allow you to get connected to the World Wide Web using JSON payloads. Now, I want to stress something here. This JSON driver program is a combination of a couple of things. It is JSON, the JSON payload management blended together with the IO server functions for this database. So this JSON driver is equivalent to an IO server on steroids. That's the important thing here. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to slide this way across over there. And I'm going to now show you what a JSON driver actually looks like. I created this JSON driver with templates, with a template. It has prototypes, it has error handling, a command, execute commands and create user space. And it has calls, prototype calls to various different authority services and other services that are used by this JSON driver to execute and perform what it needs to do. Now, the important thing here is it uses a data structure. This data structure is set up in the initialize routines. And as you will see, the data structure here is imported into the JSON driver. So it's an import data structure. Not a pointer this time, it's the entire data structure that is imported into each JSON driver from the initialize service program routine. Let's have a look at the main line. The main line simply sets up SQL options. It creates a user space for the record, and it sets the service ID to be the name of the file that it's servicing. And in this case, it's prod.ord because I created this one over the prod.ord file in your ABC Train library. Now, the JSON driver does not appear to do an awful lot. It does a call to the read input routine, which is AOOAUT at O1E. Its key string is no com. It got that out of the AO database. It calls the build JSON object routine, which is that one. This is a SQL select statement that has been enhanced to create a JSON string from a DB2 record. So you select the JSON object with these are the keys, which is the name of the data name, and the values are these trims, or if it's numeric, it's not. And you're trimming all these down, taking the spaces off characters from prod.ord. So what this does is it selects a JSON object, a particular record, out of the prod.ord and formats it into a JSON format, a JSON payload. So that is what it does. So it reads the input and it builds the JSON. It processes the build JSON actually sets up the string called JSON string, which is all of this, which is used to extract the records. Then it processes the payload. Now, it does a select. It does that routine. If it's a display, it does that routine, etc. So these are the 5 functions that are supported by the current protocols. And the protocols, of course, are documented in this document, which we wrote to support these particular functions. This is the document that is available on the AO website, the Adsera website, which gives you the protocols for the JSON payloads and the features and functions of log on, reset auth, log off, and so on and so forth, as well as how you select, how you add, etc., etc. So this is the protocol definition that the JSON driver actually supports. All of these are parser routines to put the necessary routine together. If there's an error response routine, which is also taken care of in the protocol, which sends back an error message in JSON format. Here it is here. Where are we? Failure response for all requests. That is the JSON payload that comes back if there's any error. It says error, and then it gives you a message ID, message text, message ID, message text for any of the messages that are relevant to that error. So there is a failure response which will be called through that routine. So the JSON driver itself is pretty much straightforward. It does a write output, which is actually calling a routine that does an output. So the JSON driver is an IO server, but very little of it is file specific. Most of it is done in the various service programs. Now I'm going to try, what is the time? Marinus, help me here. I've still got at least another half an hour or more to go. Should we roll this over until next session?
Tom, my suggestion would be that it is probably going to be more valuable to freeze it here, then start where we are next week, and then it's an automatic transition then into the testing of the payloads, because it demonstrates how the payloads are rendered and
Are you guys happy with that?
Yes. Right. I agree with you, Marinus.
Wonderful.
Because we have made rather heavy weather of this.
It's heavy going, and I think it will be more. It will bring everything together with the next session.
Yeah. All right. So let's rather call it quits now, and maybe if you can also put a little bit of a document together on Luvik's problem, how it works, so that I can if you can send it to me via email, I can have a look at it and be prepared for a discussion on the subjects, which we can set up sometime. Okay. Are you going to stop the recording, Marinus, or shall I?
I'll stop it.
Okay.
Okay, it is stopped.